First heading, is analytical psychology a method of treatment? There are two reasons for referring the idea of a method of treatment back to a medical context. Firstly, Freud and Jung were both doctors. Freud made the claim that psychoanalysis was a method of treatment within the context of medical science, and Jung backed him up. Later, when he modified Freud's methodology extensively and controversially, analytical psychology, as Jung then called it, was an improvement upon the psychoanalytic method of treatment in Jung's view, and certainly not an abandonment of method. And it's clear from numerous passages within his writing that Jung regarded analytical psychology as a method of treatment within a medical context. The second reason, which is more in relation to the contemporary situation of an imminent psychotherapy register and the prospect of European community legislation, is that the alternatives to a medical context for a method of treatment are unsatisfactory. Analytical psychology is only one identity among many in a spectrum of psychotherapies. Psychotherapy as a whole, in my view, continues to conceive itself as a branch of medical science, and analytical psychology should not depart from that. And where else but medicine could it turn to assess itself as a method of treatment? There is enough mystery in analytical psychology for it to be all the more important that it maintains rigor and collective validation in its methodology. So the question, is analytical psychology a method of treatment, must, in my view, be assessed within the meaning of a method of treatment as understood by medical science. And if a method of treatment is to be accepted as such by modern medicine, it must fulfill the following requirements. A, that there be an organized basis of assessment which can lead to diagnosis. B, that etiological factors either be known or, more realistically, that active attempts are being made to understand them ever more fully. C, that there be accumulated experience of the natural course of nosological entities, both in the absence of treatment and in the presence of treatment, that is, making possible a prognosis. D, that there be certain recognized maneuvers or actions which, it has been established, will produce changes different than and better than the untreated state. Looking at each of these four requirements in turn, starting with diagnosis. As a physician, I had available from my training an organized structure for the gathering of information, history taking, which, used well, provides an excellent picture of the patient and a firm foundation for the diagnosis. After the history taking comes the physical examination. In my early years as an analytical psychologist, I discarded this structured information gathering and made assessments without or with few questions, allowing the patient to tell me what they would without being directed or prompted. But for the past 6 or so years, I've assessed most new patients very much as I did when a physician. In my opinion, this is a better way to proceed. Physical examination might seem inapplicable to psychotherapy. In fact, I think that there is a closeness, and that the physical examination is simply transcribed into an equivalent examination of the signs present in the psyche of the patient, that is, signs as opposed to symptoms. And I give a fairly lengthy example of how I can connect the physical examination as I used it as a physician with the sort of metaphorically physical examination of the psyche of a new patient as an analytical psychologist. As a physician, having completed the history taking in the examination, I would hope to arrive at a preliminary diagnostic formulation, which, by accessing the pool of collective understanding, would be linked to an established etiological understanding, an established prognosis, and one or more recognized therapeutic procedures. Psychological diagnoses cannot usefully be as succinct as physical diagnoses. In both physical medicine and psychological medicine, it is a question of accepting rather arbitrary dividing lines between diagnosis and etiology. Psychological diagnoses are further complicated by the plethora of overlapping terms that are used by various schools. Analytical psychology has rather weak diagnostic identity. Psychotherapy as a whole possesses a compendium of diagnoses, and each of the individual brands of therapy avails itself of this pool. While somewhat reducing analytical psychology's individual status as a method of treatment, this situation strengthens the position of psychotherapy as a whole. Etiology. When a diagnosis has been established in physical medicine, doctors will share a common understanding of the causative factors. This is gained from pooled research and clinical experience over generations, which is passed on in the course of training, and the situation is entirely comparable in analytical psychology. It involves particularly the studies of the past 50 years into the earliest stages of human psychological development, as it is these that have advanced our etiological understanding of psychopathologies enormously. It's worth noting in passing that teleology, the importance of which has been too little understood in physical medicine, has been from the beginning a conceptual tool in analytical psychology's method of treatment. Then prognosis. Of the four, this is the one in which analytical psychology compares least well to physical medicine. In the wide range of illnesses with which we work, there exists no pool of statistically evaluated outcome with and without treatment or between different treatments. Doubtless prognosis for psychopathology will improve over time, but it will never become as scientific as physical medicine, because while analysis is indeed a method of treatment, it is not only a method of treatment, and many of the people drawn to analysis are looking for that which is more than the method. Treatment. The specificity of different treatments for different pathologies is far less differentiated in analytical psychology than in physical medicine, or at least it appears like that on the surface. For example, the treatment of a narcissistic patient and a dependent patient seem very much less distinctly different than the treatments of pneumonia or cancer of the colon. The reality is, of course, quite the reverse. The devices of all medical treatment can be divided into three levels. First level of treatment is common to all, and is the outward and ritualized container of all further treatment. For example, every variety of person and pathology first engages with GP or hospital by going through the same routines, and it's this outward and ritual container common to all patients which is the most clearly visible part of analytical psychology to the general public. The second level of treatment is the streaming of the all and sundry into classes or categories. This is done by pathologies. And the third level of treatment is unique to the individual. The great difference between physical treatment and analytical treatment lies in the different emphases between the second and third levels. Physical medicine acts mainly at the second level, the level of diagnostic categories, while analytical psychology acts mainly at the third level, the level of the uniqueness of the person. So the treatment specificity is actually very high, which is also why prognosis in analytical psychotherapy as a whole is so poorly developed compared to physical medicine. At this third level of treatment, the arena is the relationship between analyst and patient, and the therapeutic efficacies exist in the patient's innate self-healing capacities, and the therapist's development within himself of the tools for work upon relationship, including most notably the apperception, understanding, and capacity to work with transference and countertransference. So in my view, analytical psychology meets the requirements for a medical method of treatment. The psyche, it is fair to say, is no less complex than the soma. Treatment for disturbances of the psyche is still a young area of medicine, and allowing for the fact that differing psychopathologies merge imperceptibly one into another, it is also fair to say that psychoanalysis and analytical psychology have between them in a single century gained a degree of differentiated clarity of which we should not feel ashamed. And the second, or third main heading rather, is analytical psychology, a philosophy of life. A harder question to answer, because what is and what is not a philosophy of life is less well defined. So that Buddhism, for instance, is sometimes called a philosophy of life, and the Stoics were generally regarded as having a philosophy of life. But is or was communism a philosophy of life, or is capitalism a philosophy of life? Although it's hard to define, it evidently connotes an organized structure of beliefs about life and death and everything, which more or less govern attitudes and behavior. And I suppose it is true that we share amongst ourselves an organized structure of beliefs which more or less governs our attitudes and behavior. But this as a principle would be no less true for medical practitioners or psychoanalysts. It struck me then that the question might covertly imply that we as analytical psychologists treat our patients by indoctrinating them into a philosophy of life. A thought which can't be dismissed out of hand. There are some patients who think that what they want is precisely to be indoctrinated into analytical psychology's philosophy of life. And Jung, of course, favoured the use of education or teaching the doctrine. I feel that we in the SAP repudiate the idea of indoctrinating our patients by design. However, some patients do acquire the doctrine, and they do, of course, partly through our teaching of it. Teaching the doctrine is, I think, not very useful therapeutically. Analysis does, in my view, nurture the development of a philosophy of life, but this development in the patient's psyche comes about far more as a result of their initiation into a mystery. In the next heading, analytical psychology is initiation into a mystery. There is more to analytical psychology and to psychoanalysis than a method of treatment, and that is why the question of a philosophy of life is equally relevant. The analytical method of treatment has been evolved in such a way as to make use of a mystery. So too, in an unconscious sense, has the physical method of treatment, but the latter does not necessarily, or even usually, involve any transformation of consciousness, so the question of a philosophy of life does not arise. In analytical therapy, however, the immanent capacity of the whole organism to heal itself is experienced through increasingly conscious contents, and such is the power of this mystery that most initiants find that they must develop some philosophy of life in order to account for it. In my view, this initiation into a mystery lies at the heart of the treatment. What is a mystery? It is not something which is unknowable, it's something which is untellable. And this is no less true of analysis than it was true of the classical mystery cults. I'm far from being a scholar of the ancient mysteries, but I don't think that it matters that much. They were an experience that was either undergone or not. Knowing about a mystery is categorically different from knowing it by direct acquaintance. And through my own experience of analysis as patient and practitioner, I know what mystery initiation is as a process. Initiants into a mystery submit themselves to a process which involves laying themselves open to something from beyond. In the light of this viewpoint, one may see that the method and the mystery are, in a sense, one and the same. As the psychology of development has extended and refined analytic method, the power of the mystery has grown because of the enhanced possibilities of conscious transformation. The entire idea of consciousness being developed, added to, altered, and of suffering being transformed by looking into and paying attention to the unconscious is really unmistakably an initiation into a mystery. And the whole emphasis on refraining from education as much as feels reasonable is again consistent with an initiation into a mystery, because it is the experience of oneself rather than the education that counts. And those who have been in analysis and experienced this become another one of an ever-growing number of people who possess a special knowledge of themselves. And it is common, even the rule, for people who come into analysis and have no other contact with analysis to begin to wish to find friends or acquaintances who have also experienced this initiation. No matter whether it comes in the form of psychoanalysis or analytical psychology, analysis is an initiation and could properly be called a cult. Analytical psychology would not want to be considered a cult in the public estimation. A method of treatment is far more respectable, and hence the importance of analytical psychology being able to justify itself as a method of treatment for the unwell. And the next heading, analytical psychology is a preeminent contemporary channel for participating in the ancient nature mysteries. Both analytical psychology and psychoanalysis are methods of treatment involving contemporary initiations into a mystery. This confirms them both as exponents of a philosophy of life, but it does not distinguish between them. Nor must one forget, in considering analytical psychology as a philosophy of life, that any philosophy of life formed by patients in the course of their analysis cannot be regarded as identical with the philosophy of life expounded by one or another school of analysis. It cannot be denied that the influence of the analyst's belief is considerable, but equally analysis is not simple indoctrination. Analytical psychology and psychoanalysis do of course expound different philosophies of life, although they also have much in common. In the present context, I'm not so much concerned with differences in theory as such, but rather the differences in mystery initiation as they're actually experienced. And perhaps the most important part of analytical psychology's distinctive identity is that it provides the safest and most authentic access to the timeless nature mysteries. Analytical psychology is consciously and willingly aware of being a descendant of the classical nature mysteries, mainly through their historically closer manifestation in alchemy. Jung made analytical psychology the natural inheritor of the alchemist's estate. This means that analytical psychologists, through their training and quite likely through their own experience, are in a position to provide understanding and amplification of material relating to the nature mysteries, should such material arise in their patients. The initiation mystery of psychoanalysis, on the other hand, is more rational and scientific, less mystical, by which term I mean, as Thomas Aquinas put it, the knowledge of God through experience. A philosophy of life does not necessarily concern itself with or involve particularly strong religious feelings. Initiation into the mystery of oneself does almost necessarily lead to the development of a philosophy of life, but some of my patients develop a philosophy of life which I would regard as more psychoanalytic than my own. Often, though, the philosophy of life I see developing in my patients embraces religious questions and sacred or numinous experiences. As individuals distinguish themselves from the religiously dominated philosophy of life in which they've grown up, for instance, Catholicism or Judaism, while the experiences arise as they find their way to new religious expressions which take account of what they find within themselves. For example, the variety of goddess religious feelings, particularly in women. In this process, as we know from Jung's work, material is thrown up from the unconscious, which often bears close resemblance to the material of alchemy and the nature mysteries. Analytical psychologists can bring an understanding to this material which can facilitate an individual's development towards a new sacralization of their life and a sense of their own psyche in relation to the cultural history of the collective psyche. And the conclusion, analytical psychology is a method of treatment. Increasing definition and understanding is being gained on norms of developments and pathologies, and this will presumably be accompanied by equivalent growth in understanding and definition of the therapeutic measures which can best help in the treatment of these pathologies. But I would not be true to myself were I to suggest that the therapeutic efficacy of analytical psychology will advance only by becoming increasingly methodical, or that I view myself simply as an exponent of a method. I do have a philosophy of life. I believe in the self. I believe in the collective unconscious in which the history of the psyche is more than personal history, and I believe in individuation. And this philosophy of life of mine has been developed and refined through many years' experience of analysis and enables the method to employ me as an initiator in my work as an analyst. Advances in analytical psychology's method of treatment will help in many ways, but while it does not hold for all, for most patients the method itself is no more than that which facilitates engagement with the mystery, and the experience of the mystery itself is the pharmakon, the thing which heals, and the source from which some of my patients may begin to know their own authentic philosophy of life. So that's a race through for those who didn't get the paper, weren't able to read it, and a reminder for those who did before Christmas and Paul and Brandy. Including myself.
Thank you.
I'd appreciate very much that you can't really separate method from philosophy, or that philosophy is bound to influence method, and that the either or in that sense would be, to me, would be a great loss. So that's one thing that seems to me to matter, that we've all got our own, worked out our own philosophies for what's meaningful to us in how we approach our patients. What I would like to ask a bit more about is the mystery. But I think particularly when you talk about, and I'm not sure which section it is, which you remember, when you talk about the woman whom you've been seeing once a week for a time, and after about 4 months she could suddenly say, I forget, she could express despair, I forget her words. And she didn't know what you were doing. So there was despair and anger and distrust of you. And that you could tune in on that and feel her despair. You linked it with the image of the baby at the breast, and sort of being able to express something that was reaching out to wanting more, which you didn't verbalise. And that then there was this moment that you felt was really a feeling communication, it's that non-verbal feeling communication, really, which released her into a different feeling, presumably in some sort of sense, giving her some sort of feeling of relatedness. And I suppose what I wondered was, when you called that a mystery, I can see there's a mystery element, but it seemed to me to detract a bit from the creativity in a feeling of mutuality and mutual understanding, which was a person to person, that you could tune it. She could express something in depth which had been too frightening, in case she'd lose you. You could tune in on it. And she could feel that you stayed in touch with her, so she didn't get thrown out, which was her fear, because of it. Well, that seemed to me that in some way one could think of as a feeling communication, which was creative, which has in that sense to me much more meaning than just a mystery. And when you call it a mystery, I feel deprived, because I feel you focused it away from a human feeling, understanding that's creative, but which it isn't, which to me is central and not a mystery. But it's got a mystery element, but it isn't, the main feature isn't mystery in that to me.
No. I think I understand what you mean, but it's to do really with the title of what I'm trying to think through, which, as it were, is this whole question of, is what I'm doing simply practicing a method? And if there is something more than a method, what is it there? That's really the thing which I'd been ruminating on without even quite knowing what it was that I was ruminating on. And when Christopher rang me up and said this, it focused me into thinking about it. So that, I mean, everything that you've said about the experience with this woman, I entirely agree with. But the way in which I'm wanting to use it here is to just give a tiny little illustration, which I imagined would be sort of connectable instantly to everyone here this evening, of the way in which the whole sort of atmosphere and charge in the space where the two people are, and something happens. And for that something to happen, in this instance and very often, what it needs is a person who is able to respond, as it were, not at the more immediate sort of automatic ego level, in which case one's likely to feel quite offended and hurt if one's being, trying to be competent at something, and someone says they don't know what you're doing, and they feel so. To be at the place where this thing can happen, one has to have experienced something oneself, and it is the sort of the coming through a door into the experiencing of that woman, which I'm saying is another sort of great component, as well as the method, of what we do, and that it is actually out of that it's out of the quality of that experience rather than the techniques of method that the philosophy of life of the patient or of ourselves, ourselves as patient or the patient as patient, develops. So that's why I use the mystery. It's not intending to detract
do
from
see
it.
that, absolutely. And in some sense that means that quality of feeling response or effective understanding that you could, it means it's much more than method that you could understand that. But it's more than method in terms of the person you are, in terms of your emotional experience. Which seems to me more than... Well, I think you need both sides, because I think if you just call it mystery, you're missing out on something rather important.
Well, but when you say mystery, I wonder if you're thinking of it as something that's just unknown, because the way the term is often used nowadays, sort of colloquially, is it's something that is not understood, and maybe you're thinking that I'm saying...
I'm taking it the way you said. You said it's not unknowable, but it's untellable.
Yeah.
And you see, it seemed to me that something in that experience
is tellable.
Is tellable.
Absolutely. All sorts of things are tellable, but when you and I tell it between us, you don't get, if there isn't that same thing that happened with me and that woman. So that what is tellable is, you can describe everything about it. We could be enormously clever about
yes,
it.
and it's not
But it
just
wouldn't
clever,
actually
and I think this is what
necessarily
I'm
is.
jibbing at, that you're saying, is it just method when it's technique, or is it mystery? And I'm saying I think it's much more than technique. I think it's the personal experience and what you bring to it, which you can also isn't just mystery, it's tellable.
Well, I don't want to
the whole
sort of...
story.
I'm not going to stand forever on the word mystery. You know, if you don't like the word mystery, that's okay. I'm sure we're actually appreciating the same experience.
I think so.
And I'm sure I could find other words for it than mystery. So I'm not going to defend the word.
I would have thought it's fully tellable as between analysts. It's somebody who hasn't been in analysis and isn't an analyst for whom it would be a mystery. It doesn't seem to me to be so very mysterious to us, because it seemed to me that Kate was understanding it in the full way, and I would have thought in reading it we could get that feeling, because we know that type of thing from our own analyses usually, and also from being analysts, which comes from the accumulated experience of the years of working as an analyst, or being an analyst, I would say, rather than working as an analyst. I wanted to add that, but I can't go on with the other things I want to say at the moment.
Sorry, I feel the same about that. And I can see I'm going to get really stuck on this, because you're using mystery in the sense there of something incomprehensible, or I'm not saying that one can't understand it. I suppose the way in which I'm using the word mystery is the experience of what Kate is calling the Eros connection, or
But it's also connected with Jung's talking about the confrontation with the unconscious, and on your page 8, section where you said, the last paragraph but 1, looking into and paying attention to the unconscious. That's what Elie Imbert brings out a lot in his book about Jung, that paying full attention to the unconscious is indescribable to someone who's not been in analysis, but I would have thought that we could assume a great deal about what, which is difficult to describe. Well, one certainly can't define it, let alone describe it. The confrontation with the unconscious, which is what I assume we do go through day after day with our patients. And that isn't something that we can be scientific in the way in which you seem to me to be using scientific in the medical introduction, which obviously you were writing about with tremendous confidence. But scientific in what you were saying there seemed to be that it was provable or repeatable, whereas that is too separate, I felt. I mean, I was fascinated by all the medical thing coming from a non-medical preliminary before becoming an analyst. But you seem to be using a rather narrow definition of science, and also perhaps a narrower definition than, well, I'm trespassing now. I was going to say, a narrower definition of what you meant to convey by being a scientist, which appeared to be so very cool and distant as compared with really the shared knowing with the patient, which can be described as scientific, because you begin gradually to know more about it. And
Well,
science as knowledge, full psychological knowledge, I don't mean just clever brain knowledge, I mean the gradually fuller and fuller, but never complete knowledge that we get through analytic experience. Well, that is originally non-scientist is what appeals to me about a scientific approach to analysis. That it's the gradual finding out, even if it's unprovable. But your view of science seemed to be perhaps that it had got to be repeatable and fit into a category.
Well, no, there's a difference between a scientific approach and a method of treatment, which it sounds to me as if you're taking my remarks about a method of treatment as if they were about a scientific approach, which is can be a very much more open thing. So that if the question had been, is analytical psychology a path of research, then the things that you've been saying would be very apt. But I think it's a good question. I think it's a sort of a question which I think is going to turn out to be fairly relevant if Europe continues to hold together. To what extent psychotherapy can justify itself as a method of treatment, because it's, as soon as one does have a term like a method of treatment, and if this is regarded as offering a method of treatment, then, as I say, one's got to have something to refer a method of treatment to. And what I'm saying really is that, as far as I can see, it needs to be referred to what is meant in medicine as a method of treatment, and from that point onwards, what I'm saying is not at all individual to me. It would be simply a very standard statement of what a medical method of treatment consists of. I mean, I'm sure you've heard that the Dutch are pressing hard for no one but medically trained therapists to be able to be analysts.
And psychologists. And psychologists.
And psychologists, yeah.
Does this tie in very closely to the idea of illness? You're supposed to say problem.
It does really, yes.
Or other analytical investigation.
It does.
Is that where it can be, I mean, it's rather restricted?
It is. I mean, it's not where I stand myself, but one has to take note of what is around and what sort of powerful forces may shape things. And I think it will, it seems quite likely to me that there will be a core of respectable psychotherapies and then a penumbra that are marginalized. And I think that the core are going to be, they're going to have their right to be there because of being able to demonstrate enough links with orthodox medicine.
Could I bring... I better not talk again. I'll wait.
I'm surprised there's not more disagreement about it. Jenny, you look as if you're shaking your head.
Well, I think you're actually approaching the part of your paper that worries me the most, which is the question that you're trying to address. Is it a method of treatment? And I think we've got to be very careful about being drawn into answering this question. And I think in a way you've begun to talk about it. Is it that we're becoming very afeared about what we do, that we have to begin to find ways of justifying it? And I think I feel very bothered about that, because in a way we might be hoisted by our own petard in making an effort to answer this question, because actually I'm a doctor too, and I think that you could read this paper in a way that says, well, it isn't a method of treatment because we can't prove that what we do makes people better. We may change them. I mean, you used the word better at one point. I mean, do we make people better? What do we mean by better? And I mean, I think if you get into a medical argument with somebody and they insist that you prove that somebody is better, we don't want to be in that argument. And I think it's very... I understand exactly what you're saying about what's happening in Europe.
I don't. I wish you'd put that a bit more clearly than you did when you spoke just now and said the Dutch say something or other. Could you put that a bit more? How has medicine and psychology got to come together to please the Dutch? Or whoever.
Well,
I mean, I should know these things, but I haven't kept up to date. What's the basis?
I hope and expect there are some people here who know more about it
Well,
than I do.
I mean, I could say something about it because I've just come back from the UK Standing Conference.
Please do that.
Well, please do.
Weekend. I mean, I don't think that's actually quite accurate. I mean, the reference to Dutch, I think, is the reference to a European Association of Psychotherapy, which the Dutch, or which some people in Holland have initiated. And there was a move in that association to restrict the term psychotherapist to psychiatrists and psychologists. I mean, in fact, that came mainly from the Germans. But it has in fact now been voted down, not least because of the efforts of Michael McCorney representing the UK Standing Conference. And I think it's quite, the role of the UK Standing Conference is actually very important in this. And I think it does suggest that your suggestion that there will be a respectable core with the rest marginalised may not actually be the case. That you see, just the UK Standing Conference is unique in Europe because it is a body which brings together all the forms of psychotherapy, the so-called respectable and the so-called marginal. And in fact, it seems now that there is actually quite a lot of interest in Europe about what the British are doing, and that is now beginning to get the ear of the European Commission as a better way forward, because it offers the possibilities of the technical terms are equivalence rather than harmonisation. And what equivalence means is instead of everybody having to be the same, they're having to agree that everything that they do is the same, that you try and define equivalent standards which actually allow people to be quite different. So, I mean, I think that's very positive development, and I think that it's moving in a positive direction.
So can we get off the hook of actually proving that we're a method of treatment?
Well, I mean, I think we can. I mean, one of the things I noticed, about this, was that, I mean, again, coming from the UK Standing Conference, of course, most of the people in that conference would actually scream blue murder at the idea that either that the psychotherapy is a method of treatment, but even more that it should have to refer itself to medicine. And notions which I think are quite familiar and sort of dear to us really as Jungians about the importance of the relationship. Something I hear a lot of in some of the other sections, particularly in the humanistic section. I often feel more common ground with people in the humanistic section than I do with some of my colleagues in the analytical psychotherapy section.
But isn't this political because of the NHS? I mean, isn't this because unless the NHS can say that this is a form of treatment, then the psychotherapy clinics aren't going to be funded. So I think that this is, it's not about actually looking at what psychotherapy is, but it's more a political thing. But I think this thing about should we be addressing this question about people getting well, I think that's very true. I come from a psychotherapy clinic in the provinces, and one of the things that they've been working at is reducing the waiting list. And if they don't reduce the waiting list, they won't actually get some funding. And so there's all this sort of politico speak, as far as I can see, of manipulating figures to answer a question which really cannot be asked in the psychotherapy clinic, and we shouldn't be trying to answer it. And I think this is very important. We shouldn't be trying to answer this question.
In fact, should we be resisting it?
Yes. Or stating very strongly that it like doesn't apply. It's the wrong words. Not be seen as just resisting, because I think you get into sort of an either or.
The formulation of the question is wrong.
I think it would be a shame to throw it out altogether, though, because one of the things that I welcomed about the paper was the fact that some kind of structure was being applied to diagnosis.
Yes.
And that seems to be something that is very difficult to teach and very difficult to learn about, and I think rather dangerous to dispense with. So that, in a way, I think there is a place for method of treatment if it's only restricted to that area.
Are we interested in diagnosis? Yeah. I mean, really, maybe we might spend 5 years, 6 years having a patient in therapy and be working towards some formulation of the problem. But is that, what does diagnosis mean in that sense? Because you're playing into the hands of the medical model.
But it's only a small and practical observation to what you just said. But when one is seeing maybe 1 or 2 or 3 people a week who've been referred that one's going to refer on, or when one's seeing people, I imagine, for the CGU and clinic, even if you don't call it diagnosis, you have to come to some sort of assessment which is going to influence where a person goes next and to what sort of person they go on, whether to an analyst at all or to something else. And that, I certainly know that as a practical problem, and that has come into the changes that I've made in my technique of initial interviews.
But the follow-up on that is interesting, because we had a very interesting seminar, or series of seminars, with one of the assessors for the Young Clinic, who was assessing patients for students here. And we had his initial formulation, and then he showed us what happened to these clients afterwards. And it was quite astounding how wrong he was, and sometimes how right he was. And I think if you subjected that to the scientific model, you'd find that it's possible that. But the follow-up on that is interesting, because we had a very interesting seminar, or series of seminars, with one of the assessors for the Young Clinic, who was assessing patients for students here. And we had his initial formulation, and then he showed us what happened to these clients afterwards. And it was quite astounding how wrong he was, and sometimes how right he was. And I think if you subjected that to the scientific model, you'd find that it's possible that we would find that our assessments were as often completely wrong as they were right.
Yes, but what I would say to that is that it leaves an awful lot of room for improving assessment.
Well, maybe, but you see, it brings me back to my point about feeding into this, trying to respond to this question. If we can hang ourselves on this hook. If we say we're prepared to answer this question, we're forced down a path that might actually end up with us looking a bit silly.
Answer which question?
Whether this is a method of treatment. Well, personally, I feel it is important that it can know itself and show itself to be a method of treatment, and personally I feel that is the case.
A method of treatment, is it better to use the word treatment of all these things that And this is the other aspect of the mental model, from the very positive one that you were putting forward, which I hold to. But I keep remembering Winnicott's response when he was making an interpretation in an analysis, and the patient, as we know this sort of thing very often, the patient objected forcibly and felt affronted that he should make such an interpretation. And I forget exactly what she said, but Winnicott said, I don't make interpretations to treat you. I'm making interpretations to try to understand you. And it seems to me if medicine and psychology are properly married, that's what we get. We're trying to evolve methods of understanding one another, aren't we?
Well, certainly.
That's the danger with diagnosis. I mean, the diagnosis is only a tool. It's only a hypothesis. It's only something from which you can use as a springboard. It's not a thing in itself.
But we do.
And I think what happens is that it gets made into a thing of itself, and then that's
because medicine is so much treatments of things. We can't get away from that.
Could we possibly bring in the concept of mana at this point? When I was reading your paper on 2 occasions during it, on page 2 and also a bit later, I wrote the word mana down because it seems to me that the authority of the doctor is really very different from the kind of authority which develops, because it's not exactly an authority, during analysis. The dialogue which develops during analysis gets away from the authority and the mana. Mana being an unconscious projection from the patient or the prospective patient, the interviewee or someone who's being assessed, according to your model, might be at risk of projecting onto the medical assessor more mana than what I believed was anyway the old-fashioned Jungian approach, in which people are hardly patients at all. They're analysans. I mean, I can remember a great deal of anger in the, so to speak, hyper-Jungian world when the LAP, the Library of Analytical Psychology, called its second volume Analytical Psychology, or sorry about technique, it was called Technique in Analytical Psychology. Actually, I felt rather guilty about that because I was on the committee and we took a long time trying to decide what to call the book, and I suggested Technique, and Michael Fordham, among others, that's it, that's what we want. But all the sort of Zurich people couldn't bear the idea of technique, which they thought was sort of the treatment idea carried to excess. And the analytic relationship, hopefully, minimizes the projection of mana into the analyst. And the medical model seems to me possibly at risk, rather in the same way that a non-medical analyst can be a receiver of mana if he or she appears to be very erudite about the Greek mysteries, for example.
Well, I first of all don't actually agree with you in that I think being, as it were, very non-doctorish and very non-authoritarian and everything else, it is still possible for immense mana to be invested into the analyst. So that's sort of first blanket disagreement.
Well, I thought I tried to say that it is there, but it gradually changes from the diagnostic situation to during the analysis.
But regarding the actual diagnostic interview, I agree with you there. And I mean, I can certainly see sometimes when I'm questioning a person in a way that actually really looks at every part of their life and every relationship, and I push it through in 50 minutes. I do sometimes see that people are quite awestruck by the process. Simply, as it were, they haven't experienced that sort of handling of their life and experience. And I mean, no doubt that's sometimes a problem for them to work with whether they're going to work, which, and I see just the same. I mean, the people who've had an assessment of other sorts coming to me have a certain amount of mana projections of their assessing analyst, which they deal with to begin with. But I mean, I'm only talking about that as an assessing interview. I'm not referring to it as something which is my mode of analysing.
But would you use that, whether it's an assessment or, I mean, if I can see to use it to pass on to somebody else to get your label, your diagnosis, your working something. But I mean, I was intrigued by the fact that you didn't do it at first when you first were training or after training, and then you do it again, having sort of being medically trained and then sort of abandoning it myself. I just wonder whether it will be something that will come back, or will only come back for a purpose, like an assessment, or like sending someone to somebody else.
Well, that's all I use it for.
So you don't use it if you're then going to see the patient yourself?
I sometimes do, but sometimes not.
Oh, I don't think that was clear.
No.
I think it makes a big difference to the understanding of your paper.
Really, which bit exactly? The fact that I use it for assessing people who are going to go elsewhere? Or?
Well, that you haven't, I mean, I understood when I read the paper, I thought you meant that you used that method in working with your patients. And,
you mean on an ongoing basis?
Yes.
It's very clear that it's a first interview, isn't it?
Well, I
certainly
hope to.
As a first interview.
Well, maybe the first interviews in your working with your patient, but I mean that it's different to do that. I mean, to do that is different than not to do that, and it's different if you're saying that you're using that method for the purposes of referring on. I think that's very different, but I hadn't understood that. I thought you meant that you used that as your method in working with people. When you started to work with them, you actually used the method you're describing here.
No, well, in that case I failed to make myself sufficiently clear, but no, I wouldn't even think of working like that on an ongoing basis.
Yes. First of all, I want to say I like the paper, and I quite value it as a lay analyst, the first part, because, well, although I don't think society ever instructs us as lay analysts that we must have medical cover for our patients, my own analyst, who is medical, certainly has emphasised, I think that's one of, I mean, he hasn't involved himself at all in my training, but I think that's one thing that whenever discussion about patients has come up, it's been put as absolutely crucial to have medical cover if you're a lay analyst. And if I think about why do I call my patients patients and not analysts or clients, it's partly because I tell myself, well, if they get better, I might not need to worry quite so much about the method or as to why they get better. But if they get worse or become ill, in calling them patients, I'm taking some sort of responsibility that won't end at that point. I will seek to get them hospitalised in the best way possible that won't be detrimental to their therapy. And for that, I need the backup and support of psychiatrists, or I need to liaise with GPs or whatever if my patients become sicker or have a psychotic breakdown. And so for me the medical model is very important in that sense in all the work I do. Also, if a patient says, well, why do you think I should come 3 times a week or 4 times a week or twice a week? I hope I'm basing it on some kind of limited, as yet, because I haven't got that great body of experience behind me, but some sort of acknowledgement of the etiosis or where I think their problem first developed, as to why I might think it's very important for them to come more often, or even that I wouldn't be prepared to work with them on a once-a-week basis. So I understood your paper very much as a first interview, regardless of whether you were going to continue to see that patient or decide to pass them on. And often you make that decision in the first interview, unless specifically doing an assessment
and the patient knows that it is only an assessment, they won't be seeing you. So for me, I found it rather creative, your use of the medical model, and I would like to kind of memorise it and not go through it religiously or methodically, but to know it was there as a map when I'm seeing a patient for the first time. But there were things I wanted to say about the middle of the paper, which I won't because they haven't come up in the discussion, but I do want to turn to the end of the paper. Well, I don't want to take up too much time. I just want to turn to page 9, the second to last paragraph on page 9, where you say, I won't read all of it, but I'll go into the middle of it. This means that analytical psychologists, through their training and quite likely through their own experience, are in a position to provide understanding and amplification of material relating to the nature mysteries, should such material arise in their patients. And at the end of the paper you also talk about your respect for the collective unconscious, which I share in my work. But I can't agree that through the training, it's possible through my analysis and through my own life's experience that I feel I've got some ability to do this. But I think that our training very much leaves out that dimension. I don't think that we should all have to study the mysteries, but I think that times have changed, that a lot of us, that we're all under so many more kind of pressures and balancing acts, that the assumption that because we're Jungians, we've done an awful lot of reading in allied fields is mistaken. It certainly was in the year that I trained with. And when I was a student of English literature and when I was doing research, very often people would then say to me, well, what do you think, first-year students coming to read English, what books would you recommend them to read in the summer before they come into university? And I, along with lots of other people, would say, oh, well, surely the Bible, Ovid's Metamorphoses, and Robert Graves' The Greek Myths. And if they can manage some of that, well, they might be able to carry on from there. But it's, I mean, I find quite extraordinary how many of us haven't read Grimm's fairy stories or any of these sort of bodies of work that would lead us into a further understanding of the collective unconscious. So I don't feel I've been trained to do that. I'm still struggling every day just to increase my knowledge a little bit.
And I say, is that any less a piece of our culture than Robert Graves?
No, it isn't.
And is it any less to do with the collective unconscious? Because she went to go on and talk about all the things that are in this soap opera which are to do with family dynamics and tensions of relationships and stuff like that. And it was really quite amplificatory on the dream she was really talking about. And so I'm interested in this idea that if it's classical, it's the collective unconscious, but if it's EastEnders, it's rubbish.
Well, I didn't say that. That's like saying that one's child can't get an enormous amount out of Tintin or Batman. It's a different kind of myth.
I'm not saying you said that, Jane, but I do feel that it was drifting slightly that way. And I feel that is an issue in Jungian doodles.
But there are, you know, speaking of the Bible, we used to be brought up with a constant input in most schools of passages from the Bible. And there are patients who refer to those, perhaps without even knowing it. And if you've got a scheme of reference within you that resonates with it, you can be in touch in a certain way. Just as if you've seen EastEnders when your patient's talking about it.
I haven't seen EastEnders at all.
Well,
I have read the Bible extensively.
But you see, it is noticeable that there are so many people around there who have not read the Bible and who don't resonate in the same way.
Well, poor old Charles Darwin couldn't get on because he read the Bible.
Yes.
I think I'm talking about something which starts to be an idealisation of this kind of literature. And, I think that's more of a hindrance, especially when it's talking about training and becoming an analytical psychologist and feeling authentic and ideas of respectability which we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. What I wonder, because Roderick brought in his paper when he said an initiation is really to do with the here and now experience. And you can't read about the initiation of the early cults because it's their experience.
We could read about them, but it's different.
You can read them, but it isn't the same. And that if this isn't relevant to what we're saying, that the here and now experience in the analytic relationship, even how that's enhanced, and it could well not, doesn't necessarily mean being amplified by nature cults is going to enhance the here and now, or it could. But and what you're saying could equally, and in that sense, if one keeps it as a relative value, and what needs to be included in the training, is very difficult given the time. And some people really, I think people vary enormously how much it appeals to them and how much they resonate to it. And if they do, they can use it in a real way. If they don't, it's irrelevant.
But is it true that to think that Freud and Jung clashed and had to separate, and the world's probably better for the fact that they did separate, on the basis of Freud being very much the medical discipline, really, and Jung wanted to explore his psychological understandings that Freud didn't value much.
It's not a way of dividing it that I would...
You wouldn't go along with that?
No, not really. I think Jung was he continued to feel his role as a doctor strongly, I think.
Well, I think he did, yes, that's right.
Perhaps more so than Freud in this instance.
Well,
yes. Freud did, after all, write the paper on the analysis. Very thankful one, actually.
In many ways, he was actually more of a scientist than a doctor.
But also Jung wrote about Weltanschauung. I was wondering where your phrase, or the term which you perhaps wanted for the year, of philosophy of life, and after all Jung wrote about Weltanschauung, is attitude to the world. If you translate Weltanschauung literally, it's sort of attitude to the world, isn't it? Maybe somebody's better at German than I. Veronica. Is Weltanschauung different from philosophy of life?
Yes,
it is different, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. And Weltanschauung grows with great difficulty, I think, during our years as analysts. And it seems to me that it's more learnable how you described the way of being a doctor and doing the assessments. I could imagine learning that, and it was a very good paper from that point of view. Rather like Jane said, there's a lot to be learned from it. But it's much more difficult to learn or develop in yourself, which is a better way than saying it than learning, the Weltanschauung side of it. And there, the background of being someone who came to analysis through art subjects, which I don't really like describing in terms of being a lay analyst, and I don't like non-medical, because those are both negative ways. At least lay is less negative than non-medical, but non-medical sounds like describing us, those of us who are non-medical, in negative terms, rather than that we've got our knowledge of history and literature to contribute. And this is where your paper's difficult. It's terribly important. I found it very, very interesting, important paper. But it's very difficult to get the two sides linked in closely, because you say you don't feel very comfortable, or you appear less comfortable on the philosophy side. This may or may not be true, of course, as compared with perhaps people who've done a lot of literature and read a whole lot of literature and history and religion and all the many arts subjects. And analytical psychology is, I think, literally fascinating because it's such a combination of the two, which is what I personally have got from it. I gave a paper about Weltanschauung once to the SAP, the analytic group, and it was very badly received. Everybody was very friendly about it, but they more or less said, go home and do some more living, and you can write that paper again in 10 or 20 years' time. And I haven't yet rewritten it, but because the philosophy of life side seems to be more about living, and also living with our patients.
I must say, I think I like the word better, way of life, rather than philosophy of life, because I feel that philosophy of life can be very detached and academic, and I think the way that one is and lives, it's much more about what is actually within you as a person.
I suppose what Roderick said in his own bit is that what he believes in, or what in that I take it means that he's really found useful, creative is the collective. Do you say collective unconscious?
That's something that I believe in, yes.
And the self and individuation. And it seems to me that this is where the focus of your work shifted from Freud, and the break into is a tremendous interest in the collective unconscious.
And archetypes and symbolic transformation, all the things that Freud wasn't really terribly
But somewhere or other, I just wondered in terms of the balance and how that's evolved, that when you bring in those three, that you're bringing in a synthesis of the collective consciousness and the autonomy, archetypal autonomy and dynamic in our psyche. And the self, which, Jung says so many different, he says very different things about it at different times. But in individuation, you're really talking, it seems to me, it is about finding a personal position in the collective. And that is this, would you agree that this is what your philosophy is about, getting the balance there?
Is it a serious question then? Or do you think I'm swimming in a sort of vague pleroma of
well, no, I think that
collective mishmash? That's what I do all the time?
No, it isn't.
I find it difficult to believe it is a serious question.
Well, don't you? Because, I suppose because, and this you may say is my hang-up about mystery.
I'm very pleased you've used the word mystery, I have to say.
All right, well, I'm sorry you dismiss it as a non-serious question. Yeah.
Well,
because I think the
question that I hear you asking me is whether I pay any attention to the incarnated individual and to the ego, or do I only subscribe to the collective?
No, I'm not saying it's an either or like that, but I think there's a different emphasis, and that in your emphasis in the paper, it's more on the collective. And I'm not in the least saying you're in the mishmash. I'm not saying sarcastic things like that at all. But I am saying, I think there's an emphasis. And I think
I'm talking about my philosophy of life as an analytical psychologist. Now, if I put in the consciousness and ego, which, as it were, would be a much broader psychological basis, there isn't anything specifically analytical, psychological. The things that I mentioned there are the contributions that analytical psychology, because I'm trying to talk about whether analytical psychology has a distinct philosophy of life as opposed to, or that can be separated from, psychoanalysis or other forms of psychotherapy. And there isn't actually a great deal that is distinctive. And the more that analytical psychology has absorbed ideas from psychoanalysis, and the more that it has found a firm soma base in developmental psychology, which again is shared very broadly. So what I was left with was looking at a map, as it were, and where is analytical psychology uniquely itself. And so in my little credo, because it seems to me if you have a philosophy of life, you've got to have a credo. Those are the reason they're picked out is because they are unique to analytical psychology.
Well, that answers my question, which to me wasn't a stupid one, because I hadn't realised that you were saying, this is the difference, that's why I'm focusing on the difference. And I don't feel individuation, which you do bring in, it seems to me matter very much. It's just ego psychology. I think it's something much more, which has got, to me, a Jungian roots that matter to me. As how you do integrate experience that's unconscious, conscious.
I just wanted to say, I felt mystery got knocked over the head pretty early on. I was very pleased it was in your title, and I found myself saying, during this term, as it were, having come to the talk so far, that I felt there was a fear, a fear of mystery. Because it felt to me that all the talk and discussion was becoming more and more concrete and ego-based, and that a lot of the talk about self was really about the ego, and that the Jungian self, as I understand it, didn't seem to be anywhere around. So I very much welcome the use of this word, and we do seem to be frightened of what we can't explain, and the moments which we can't make happen, doesn't matter how well qualified we are and what our method might be, there are the moments that you describe with your patient, and the how, the why and the when is inexplicable. And there is, one has, I think, to have an awe of the process which is beyond both of us in the room. I could say lots of other things, but I'd just like to say thank you for the word mystery.
Well, thank you for your appreciation of it. Although obviously I would have to agree that that one can never in any way guarantee that anything that one does or doesn't do is going to generate that mystery. But one of the things that I wanted to communicate in this is that the advancement of the method, particularly with the understanding of early psychology, does actually it puts a well-trained analyst in a position of being far more likely to be able to allow such.
But it is allowing and facilitating, and one can't decide upon it.
No, indeed.
The decision that's happening is elsewhere.
Indeed. But, to know how to dig the earth properly and to know what sort of fertilizers to put in, it's no guarantee the seed will sprout, but it helps.
I think it's a word that can help, but I also think it's a word that can hinder, because it has also the idea of secrecy as part of it. That's the mysteries, the sort of the way that the word has been used, of the mysteries. has a secrecy and something that's very exclusive. It can hold that. Insofar as it holds that, I feel uncomfortable about it. Insofar as it's something about something over which one hasn't got a control and which has a sort of spiritual dimension maybe, or a particular aliveness, then that's a very useful word. But I think it can have the other meaning too, which can
But I wondered about that other meaning, and I'm not anything like enough of a classical scholar to know for sure, but if I just follow up the link that I've made here with the experience, the analytic experience as being like or actually being an initiation into a mystery, then the forbidden to tell that you're referring to with the sort of the secrecy and so on, the way that seems to come out to me is that that quite often patients, to begin with, if they have someone who's close, a marriage partner or something, they like to try to tell what's happening. And the forbidding to tell actually develops from within them at a certain point when they realize that it's becoming impractical, or it would take, as it were, all day to really try and communicate what was happening. And that furthermore it feels as if something's sort of leaking or being dissipated. So that and I wonder how much that may have been exactly the same in the mystery cults, that it's not so much a secret police forbidding anyone to tell, but that if you want to keep that experience growing, then you're forbidden to tell from within.
I think it's probably something which has got various possibilities within it. So in other words, there are positive, very, very, very positive aspects to it, but also the negative ones of kind of being an exclusive group or something.
Well, I think it is, you see. I mean, I know it's an extremely unfashionable view of this, and I can certainly see that it would be, that no form of psychotherapy is going to appreciate being called a cult, but actually I think we are cults, and I think that we are exclusive, or some sort of inclusive that's not in groups.
In fact, maybe there are experiences that one can have in different ways, say through music, or that there are experiences which you might describe as having a mystery about it, that it can come through.
It can indeed, but I don't think anything can match the experience with another human being that is through time. Personally, I don't believe that anything else offers the same depth or mystery as that.
Like a marriage, or...
Well, yes, indeed, it can be in a marriage. If you've got a very good partner, it can be very understanding or very tolerant. Depends where one needs to go, but if someone, for their health, needs to allow an infantile part of themselves that is raging, there would be more marriage partners that would be unable to cope with it on a sort of full-blown long-term basis than there would be analysts. More would cope with it, more analysts. In my view, anyway.
Yes, I was wondering if in fact you were heading in that direction when you mentioned initiation rites.
because I liked your question. On page 1 you asked a question saying that psychotherapy as a whole continues to conceive of itself as a branch of medical science. And you say, and where else but medicine could it turn to assess itself? I was wondering if in fact you were thinking of initiation rites at that point, or was that question rhetorical?
Not quite rhetorical, because I had considered other possibilities, like homeopathy and astrology and magic, and I'm sure there would be some others. I mean, what it would need would be some sort of long-established discipline, longer than the short lifespan of analytical psychology itself, which simply hasn't been around long enough to be able to refer to itself. Medicine refers to itself, where it has no external reference for its own methodology.
Would ancient healing arts come into that? Would ancient healing arts come into that at all? Would that be established long enough and be respectable enough to be a referent?
Ancient healing arts. Well, I mean, homeopathy is one, I would say. I'm not, the term you're using, does it refer to something, a specific body? Because if it does, I actually don't know about it, I'm afraid.
Well, Church. Yes, I mean, there must be quite a number.
The church would be another alternative.
Any religious
for analytical psychology to refer itself to. But I would say that that Jung came quite close to that on a number of occasions, but actually veered from it to medicine.
I noticed then that you came down fairly positively on the side of medicine as the referent that you trusted. I was wondering if there might be
it's partly a question of its origins. I mean, we do still refer to Jung a great deal. There's never a discussion in which Jung doesn't come up quite a number of times. And he was a doctor, so as it were, his views still have some power. And the other thing is my assessment of the contemporary situation, which I've had some information on that tonight. And also, it's I still quite often see physicians and GPs that were colleagues of mine in the past. And I mean, they often ask me, what is this sort of magic you practice now? What has it got any method in it at all? Or what do you do to these people? How do you handle them? And so I find myself put into the position of thinking about what I'm doing in relation to what I used to do and the way that medicine, not psychiatry, which is rather more informed a bit in some areas, but physical medicine as a whole really, regards analytical psychology as being pretty magical. And I don't mean that in a very positive sense either.
And does the medical world, in fact, ask themselves if they're into method and mystery? Do they ask themselves if they have a mystery? I don't know. There are several doctors in the room.
I expect some do and some don't. But maybe other people can make some observations on that.
It seems to me there's a very slow magic.
You keep it very quiet.
Stretching over years, maybe.
What was the question again?
I was wondering if medically trained people would sit and ask themselves the same questions that we've asked ourselves tonight. Yeah.
I would be inclined to say that by and large they focus very much on the method, and there would be little more than sort of passing and private thoughts to do with the mystery involved. It's not that it's not felt by doctors. I think a lot of them are aware of it, but the space for discussion is predominantly scientific, methodical, ethical, and political. Those are the things which are acceptable in public discussion, not mystery.
There's a respect.
Public discussion. And you said it was a public discussion, which suggests that perhaps there's more awareness when they're, not likely to be reported on.
Well, when I'm tackled as to whether what I do nowadays, since my sort of aberration 15 years ago, has any method in it at all, I tackle them about the mystery on which they are actually building entire structures of methodical treatment. And it is, that is understood or accepted, yes, it's not out of sight.
But as analytical psychologists, I don't see how we can, I think the danger of the world mystery is something to do with inflation, that we can feel that we are initiators or we're close to the gods, but not only are our origins mysterious, the origins of language, no one knows, no scientist. There are many different theories which are coming closer together, but no one knows how language came into existence. The primal scene is mysterious. None of us know about our own conception. It's a mystery. We may have our own sexual experience. And, I think that one is constantly dealing with mysteries and consulting them. If you think about it, it's sort of extended to the gods. The unconscious is mysterious. Until it becomes conscious, it's the most mysterious thing of all. But I find myself, if I think about the gods, which from time to time I do, as well as appreciating the medical model, I often then think, well, I'm actually sort of very much dealing with domestic gods, the gods of the hearth and the hearthside, and the whole kind of mysteries of people trying to resolve their domestic lives.
I think we must finish on that note. Roderick is the first paper to have tackled the question head-on, so to speak, so I'm very grateful for that and for very provocative and stimulating paper.